there's a lot of stuff that people can do on their own. There's so much information and really cool resources on the internet that if science is your pet project, you can teach yourself amazing stuff.
Hello everyone and welcome to Geekoscopy 101, the podcast that explores the intersection between science, story and play with me, your host Dr. Janus Kisten. And today we're exploring inspiring children into STEM with narrative non-fiction with South African bilingual science writer Engela Duvenage. Welcome to the show, Engela. How are you doing?
I'm fine, thank you. It's a sunny day in Wellington, so it's a good day.
Oh, that's great. I think we've had a string of very cloudy, sometimes rainy days here this week. That's why I'm able to sit and record with you. Otherwise, I might be out in the fields or the lab. So tell us a bit about who you feel you are in this moment and what you do.
I'm a freelance science writer. I prefer writing about science and research-related stuff. I trained as a journalist, and then I worked for places like Cape Nature. I worked for community newspapers, and then also for Stellenbosch University, writing some of their science-related news stories. And then when my elder daughter went to school 9 years ago, I started doing freelancing work, and that I've done ever since. So I work for the Landbou Weekblad. I write an agri-sciences column for them, for instance, and for the Lig magazine, I write an environmental column, and I do their book reviews, which is lovely. And I do a lot of work for research-related entities like Stellenbosch University or Pretoria University or Wardgrow Science. So I take people's research and I write a popular article about that, press releases or stories and articles about people's work. And that's what I do. So I work constantly with researchers and scientists, people who are on the top of their game and they know stuff. And it's an absolutely wonderful field to work in. Yeah.
All right. How did your journey with science actually begin? When did you make that decision that this was the field you're going to deal with?
It's actually by chance would possibly be the answer. I wanted to do a master's degree in journalism after finishing off my honours degree, and at that stage the three choices were that you could either do a course in business ethics, business management, in journalism, media management, or a course in science journalism. You could specialize in that, do your MPhil. And that's what I started doing. And then I veered into environmental journalism. And that's how that started. And from there, environmental journalism, science journalism, they fall under that sub-disciplines. And that's how it started for me. And then I started working at Stellenbosch University and writing research-related work for them and at Cape Nature Conservation. So it was because of my master's degree, but I've always loved facts and little bits of information. I've always loved that. I don't have a BSc degree, but I have a degree, I always say, in finding out little bits of things. And science is it's about little bits of things, people finding out things. And it's not necessarily about the formulas or about deep science always. It's about little things people find out. And that's what intrigues me about science journalism. And speaking to people, it's about the little things people find out and how it fits into the bigger picture and what you can learn from that. And that's I'm curious by nature. I love finding out stuff, and that's why I like science journalism. And per se, it also tends to be a field that works with positive things. Even if you're an AIDS researcher, for instance, or a COVID researcher, you do work with negative stuff, yes, but you are trying to solve something, or you're trying to make something better, or you're trying to work out how it works so that someone else can solve it further. So that's one of the things that draws me to science journalism, is the fact that you're working with people who are trying to make something better, who are interested in stuff, and who finds life interesting, even if it's just in a specific discipline. Yeah, so that's what draws me to science journalism.
Sure, it was pretty cool. So all your time in science journalism and writing has culminated in a recent publication of a children's book in 2 different languages. How did that come about, and what exactly is the book about?
It started off as this is the Afrikaans one that was published last year. It's Uitvindersplanmakers en ander slim koppe van Suid-Afrika. That's the Afrikaans version. And then in August this year, the English version was published. It's Inventors, Bright Minds and Other Science Heroes of South Africa. So it's a children's book, if I can, So each story is about 3 pages long, and there's 102 stories in there. And it features people, all with South African links, who have in some way made their mark with some type of first. So that was the qualification. So there's a series of people who've done transplants, first transplants, like the first heart transplants, of course, the first 3D ear, middle ear transplant, that's in there. Even the first penis transplant, which was done in South Africa, they were all done by South Africans. Then there's a section on paleontologists, people who've discovered new species of animals or earthworms or long-tongued flies. And there's a section about inventors and a section on people who work in the space sector in South Africa, or aeronautics. There's a section on health, medicine, and also the 5 guys who've all won Nobel Prizes, who've all been, all lived in South Africa as children and studied in South Africa up to a point. How it came about is I'm a mother, and I have 2 daughters, and I always come home after, in the good old days when I did interviews at people's offices, I always come home, and then I tell them, today I spoke to a botanist, and then I tell them what the person did. Or today I spoke to a guy who discovered a new type of dragonfly, and then I tell my children about that. And every so often they'd come back from school and say they now have to speak about a scientist, and then they inevitably, or a hero, and then inevitably they talk about someone from overseas. And I'm really a proudly South African person. It started evolving, the idea that I wanted to write a book that children can use as a resource, so that if they have to talk an oral at school or do a school task or something, that they can be able to use their own people. And also I realized through my job that I have an extreme privilege of working with keen minds, people who are really doing their thing, and that's not a privilege everyone has. So to be able to introduce children, but also their parents, to the really, really cool people who often behind the scenes in South Africa do their thing in the health sector, do their things in climatology or whatever. That's one of the reasons why I did this book, is to introduce people to really cool people that they might otherwise not read about in the newspapers and stuff. So some people are quite well known, like Salim Abdul Karim is a well-known figure. And then there's a lady, for instance, who's 75 years old, and she developed a way of helping her husband to be able, he's a wind pump repairman, and she helped him to develop a way in which he can drop the wind pump without any help from someone else. And it sounds funny, but I put that story in, for instance, to say that you can be very old but still be able to make plans. And you don't need to be a professor to make brilliant plans. You can be anyone. If there's a problem to be solved, you can solve it. So there's a range of people in there. And it's my way of introducing people to really cool South Africans, that's why I did it. And I wanted to write a book for my children. I didn't want to write a book that it's taken 5 years of my life. I didn't want to take 5 years out of their life and write this deep science fiction book, which they can't really appreciate. So it's a combination of me being a mother, being a science writer, and being in contact with really cool people on a daily basis. Yeah.
You touched on the point of representation there.
Oh, representation. Sorry.
Viewpoints and people that. Yes.
Yeah. No,
how important do you think that is?
It is absolutely important. It's not only gender-wise, but also racial-based, but also age-related, and that. I think it's an important thing to tell children also that, as I mentioned, you don't have to be an academic to be interested in STEM-related fields. You don't have to be, you can absolutely do it as a hobby. Eh? You can just be interested because you're interested in the field. You don't have to have an academic qualification. But what I also know is that it's important to have, for instance, women as role models. And this book being a first of its kind for South Africa, it was difficult. So I have 102 stories in there. I could potentially write 975,000 stories, but the editor stopped me at some point. That said, it's important. It's important to have different faces, different places, different names. Eh? So I couldn't just take all the Cape Townian people who have done their thing in the past 500 years. I can't. So that won't either be. So it was a difficult issue of deciding who to use, who to not use. But South Africa being South Africa, I couldn't also just focus on the first years of South African science. That would have skewed the thing too. But it's amazing the amount of people involved in South African science over the years. Ne? Did you know, for instance, that the first person that qualified as a vet in South Africa, so the first South African-born vet, was a black guy called Utelo Soga. He's on my front page of the book. And that was in the 1880s somewhere. Ne? And I don't think people necessarily know that.
Wow.
So only after 20 years after him, I think it was Mr. De Tooy, he became the first South African-born vet. And that's the type of story. So you think that all stories would, say, in the 1800s be white, but they're not. Ne? And it was nice for me to be able to get that type of stories out there and in a bulk form, I'd say.
For sure. Yeah, I agree. It's pretty important to have these stories out and have this diverse collection, which is really cool.
Yeah.
So you write professionally
can I add something
as a science
there?
writer.
Something I also wanted to mention about the representation. It's also important to. One of the reasons there's so many stories is that I wanted to have different fields, so that children know that you can either go into zoology or you can be interested in physics or with the various, but they all make the bulk of science. And finding people in all of those fields that are of interest, that was nice. Yeah, but they all have some type of first to their credit.
So you write professionally as a science writer in both English and Afrikaans.
Yeah.
How do you find it difficult sometimes writing certain concepts or about certain concepts, explaining certain things in two different languages? Or do you just have it down to an art at this point?
I think it depends on the topic, and it often depends on the scientist involved. Often, my work is made very easy by a very good science communicating scientist, someone who knows how to explain it, a teacher by heart. So that's that. Then my work gets much easier. Sometimes it's more difficult depending on the type of science and the type of topic. It's all the quantum physics will always be much more difficult to write about than the discovery of a new species of fish. It will always be. That's just how it is. It's the nature of the topic. So the topic depends on, provides you with lots of input, the scientists themselves, and then sometimes some things are just easier. I really enjoy writing about the environmental and agri-sciences stuff and animals and plants. That's my thing. I struggle more with chemistry, and that's just because that's not necessarily my interest. But it's always an interesting exercise trying. Often I have to do the same article that I write in English, I also have to write in Afrikaans, or vice versa. And that's always interesting to realize, are there words in one language that's also in the other? And should I just literally translate it, or can I try and do it better? And that's a really, really nice exercise. I'm hoping that it will keep my brain active and healthy until I grow old, because I think you keep on thinking about things. It's not always easy. Certain words, even in English, so often people will say, oh, I only know this term in English. But even in English, that term doesn't say much. Like this morning, I had to read a piece about cryogenetics. Right? So if you don't know Latin, you won't necessarily know that cryo refers to ice or freezing and things like that. So even in English, it's not necessarily easy. I can then translate it back to Afrikaans, but you do often need some form of explaining, but then you have to, in your explaining of your sentence, it doesn't help just using that word. You need to explain it, and that's why I often think science writing and people in the science writing field are all teachers by heart. I come from a long line of teachers, and I think that's why I enjoy science writing, is because it's an explaining exercise. The whole thing is about explaining things as easy as possible so that other people understand what life is about. And it's nice. But language can be a barrier, but if you use it, if you don't confine yourself to specific words and specific jargon, it becomes interesting, and fun.
You and some colleagues and some other people have a few years ago decided to start a science communication media brand called Cybri. How did that begin, and what exactly are you trying to accomplish?
It started between myself and Anina Mum, who also does a lot of science communication work. So it started off on the steps of a university in Finland. And we met each other in Finland at the World Conference for Science Journalists. So she's in Pretoria, I'm based in Wellington. And we met there and we started chatting a bit about the fact that there's not much known about South African scientists, and that we both have the honor of working with South African scientists, and that we wanted to share that. So we set out to do Cybri, which is a science bri, and the payoff line is round the fire stories about South African science. So we wanted to create a hub where people can read up on figures in South African science, lesser known and well-known figures, and certain research outputs that people have, that we can celebrate South African science, and that's our effort. And then later on we got colleagues involved. Sibusiso Bayela does a lot of our Zulu writing. So I do a lot of the Afrikaans writing and English writing, and Nina also more of the English ones. And Sibusiso does absolutely valuable work in writing in Zulu. I think he's the only guy writing in Zulu science-related work. And so he's done a lot of work and has become quite a strong voice for talking and writing about science in other South African languages other than Afrikaans and English. And he's spoken on many international forums already on decolonizing science and using indigenous languages, and not only always English. He would be a great person also to chat to for your podcast, because he has amazing thoughts on that. And it's we run it as a non-profit, and no one gets paid, and we do it as we have time. But it's one of those brands. We also have a Facebook page and a YouTube channel, and we try and just share good news stories about South African science. It's our proudly South African initiative.
Yeah, for sure, it's pretty cool. I do know another guy, Fortune Parker, who also writes in vernacular language. I'm not sure if it's Xhosa or Zulu, but yeah, I think you guys need to get a hold of him as well. But I definitely intend on having those two on the show to just talk about how difficult it would be to try. And I mean, Sibusiso has written about it, but it's not something you think about, I think, when you're a native English speaker, but just how difficult it is to translate certain concepts into other languages that just don't have that concept, or anything close to that concept. And you have to kind of break it down and kind of go to the root of where an English word comes from, and then build it out back. And it's fascinating, like the linguistics involved to try and re-communicate science in different language.
No, absolutely. I'm quite sure that he creates new words in Zulu in the process of writing. My mother is a Latin teacher, and it comes in handy at the best of times when I am stumped about how to explain. For instance, if I'm writing in Afrikaans, sometimes I need to explain a word, and then it helps to ask her, what's the root again? Where does this word come from? How does it work? And as you say, you have to build it up, go back to the roots, and then decide how to do it.
Pretty interesting, and that's something you would think about just being an English native. So that's great work that you guys and other people now are delving into. Adjacent to that, being in the science writing and science journalism industry for a while now, how do you think going forward we can improve in our science communication and public awareness of important scientific concepts or news or anything like that?
What I can say about that is that there's definitely been, among institutions in South Africa, I've been doing this now for about 20 years. In the past 10 years especially, institutions in South Africa have done a tremendous amount of work to get more science-related stuff into the media. And many people, so when I started at Stellenbosch University at the beginning of 2004, I was the only science writer, other than one other faculty had a science writer, for instance. Now most of them have, and most other institutions also. And that their work is to get the research out there into the public domain. So many institutions in South Africa now employ, generally we are all former journalists working in different spaces now, because there's no science desks anymore at most of our newspapers. Interestingly enough, many journalists over the past year and a half have become science journalists, having been forced into writing COVID-related, health-related stories. And in that way, I need to salute many of the journalists who have in the past 18 months done an extreme amount of work trying to get the public to understand the basics of COVID a bit, either on television, either on internet sources, in infographics, in newspaper articles. There's always more work to be done, always. Your question is, what can we do moving forward? I think we first need to go and stand still and say thank you to the people who've done a lot of work and had to teach themselves a lot of science. That also said, there's a lot of organizations who are helping journalists to understand, say, the medical issues, the health issues, for instance, about COVID. Or about climate change. I'm thinking, for instance, about Internews, who've done a lot of training for journalists in the past year on COVID-related matters. The Earth Science Journalism Network, they, for instance, do a lot of training for journalists about climate change-related work. And I think the best way of going forward is if you're a journalist and you find yourself working constantly with certain beats, retrain yourself in certain fields. There's so many free courses out there, paid courses, just to give yourself some backing. So on the one hand, institutions send out a lot of research-related news to our media, and it gets picked up, which is really cool work because it's a way of getting science out there. But you still need the journalist to say, yes, this makes sense, or no, this doesn't make sense, and to follow up on the story, or to decide when to use a story or not. And you still need the journalist going to write the story on a COVID-related issue with a good idea of what's going on. And I think retraining, many people who are doing general journalism work, I think in the past year have retrained their brains and have all become science journalists in a big way. There's a lot of stuff that people can do on their own. There's so much information and really cool resources on the internet that if science is your pet project, you can teach yourself amazing stuff. There's lots of open, those MOOCs, say UCT for instance, they have a lot of free online training and courses in, for instance, paleontology that they present. And people can do their own thing. I think the important thing is that people trust the sources that they use, and that they use credible sources in the finding of science-related news and science-related information, and not go off into Alice's wormhole and find theirs. Use credible sources, use people that you trust, and listen to voices. I, for instance, in the whole COVID pandemic, I've made a decision to follow specific epidemiologists and specific science journalists on Facebook, for instance. I follow them and I get my news from them because I find them to be credible sources. So that's a way of doing your own science journalism work. Becoming your own science communicator is train yourself also.
Yeah, for sure. I think, COVID has been a terrible thing for everybody across the planet, but one of the silver linings, I think, is that it did push the science communication, science journalism industry forward, probably many years, especially in South Africa. I think the number of positions for communicators has increased, definitely tangentially from what I've seen. Everybody is hiring now communicaters. So.
Yeah. It's on the one hand a reflection on what's happening in straightforward journalism. That the science desks are becoming few and far between. And on the other hand, it's also a reflection on, as you say, the technology that's available. You can do your own thing for free if you want to. If that's your passion, Why not? You don't have to be confined. You're a perfect example of someone taking their passion and then running with it and using the technology to your advantage.
Many other scientists, I think, because they were stuck at home, just started like YouTube channels and podcasts and TikToks, TikTok accounts. And so it has pushed, I think, science communication and journalism in general. And hopefully we can keep the momentum going for other things like climate change and food security and all the other problems that are just beyond the horizon after we get done with the pandemic. So.
Yeah. Something like climate change, for instance, is a difficult concept. That's what they've always also said about the HIV thing. Climate change and HIV is quite similar in the fact that you are working with a non-immediate threat. And therefore, it's so much more difficult to get people's mindsets into it. Eh? Whereas COVID is 5 days, you get it, you get ill. Sure, yeah. Where AIDS is a much more longer progress. Climate change also. Although we're now seeing research coming out that's showing stuff to be now, whereas say 20 years back it was a really difficult concept to sell. And that's probably one of the reasons why there's more climate change related science communication work coming out. It's because it's now becoming more visible, unfortunately.
For sure, I think it is a lot more visible now, especially with like just drastic changes in weather in certain parts. Just colder winters or warmer summers and droughts and floods, and it's at some points it's like apocalyptic in certain parts of the planet in certain times of the year. So it is, I think, becoming more and more apparent. What I really enjoy now about climate, I suppose climate communication is just people writing like fiction stories, like cli-fi. There's an entire genre of writing, and just framing the climate threat, I think, in a more relatable way. Because, like you said, it's so long. It takes a while to show. I think the way writers try and get it to a more relatable level in terms of using like human stories, I think is one of the better ways now we can, or a different way, because different people will understand concepts in different ways, and if we can get as many different genres, many different media formats, like that's gonna help over just trying to do it one way, just writing like blog posts or newspaper articles and TV adverts, like not. And like, I don't think kids even read any of that stuff now anyway. They're on different platforms watching different type of content. So we are going towards an industry that is just, it's very fragmented in the different types of media you can do, and we need it. And we need people to get onto every new platform as they come out. We have to be as agile in our communication as I think like the corporate businesses are. Otherwise we'll always be on the back foot every time.
Absolutely. But that's what's so interesting, that there isn't just one way of doing science communication. So I wrote a children's book because I think it's a good resource for schools and stuff. There's other people doing graphic novels. You're doing podcasts. Other people are writing columns. But there's other people are, as you mentioned, writing books, and that's such a subtle way. I'm quite a firm believer in subtlety. Eh? So I want to teach children about scientists and science careers and stuff. But then I write a story with a nice adventurous line to it. And subtly I tell children about different jobs and stuff. I don't tell them about different jobs. I tell them about it. My father used to say, it's like smokkel met iemand se kop. You smuggle with someone's head. subtly. Yeah? So people don't necessarily always want to they don't necessarily always have to be told. Yeah? You subtly tell people. And I think that's one of the nice ways of using different media. As you mentioned, books. What did you call the genre?
It's cli-fi. That's the short version. Climate fiction.
I like that.
The greater genre about that is eco-fiction.
Yeah.
And then under eco-fiction you get cli-fi, and you get other things like solar punk and different genres within it.
Yeah.
But cli-fi I think is the big one.
Yeah.
For sure. So I think we both learned a lot during this podcast, but I think it's a good spot to end it. So Engela, why don't you let everybody know where they can find your work on the internet?
It's you can search it. The English version is at Penguin Random House. You can find it on Amazon. You can buy a Kindle version, and then you can also find it on the most bookstores, exclusive books, bargain books, the whole works. And the Afrikaans one is the easiest way is to find it at LAPA. They're the publishers. And then you can also track us on our Instagram page, SR Uitvinders, and also Facebook, SR Uitvinders, or SA Uitvinders. Yeah, that would be the easiest. Or just send me an email. But most bookstores have it, which is kind of nice.
It is nice. Well, thanks so much for joining, Engela. It's been a fun chat.
Thank you. Thank you so much.